Hello, everyone. I'm Laurel McHargue, host of the Alligator Preserves podcast, and we have with us today again a friend of mine. Her name is Kathy Taylor. Kathy, welcome to Alligator Preserves.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here too. 2 years ago, can you believe it was 2 years ago? I interviewed you about your book, Trees and Other Witnesses. And let me just tell you, this is a stunning book. And you recently contacted me because you have a new book called The Birthing House. So we're going to talk about The Birthing House today, which is, oh my goodness, a very complex book. But first, I want you to reintroduce yourself to our listeners, because again, 2 years ago, you were someone, and now you've written another book. Who are you today, Kathy Taylor?
Well, I think I've finally decided I'm a writer. For a long time, I thought, I write, but I do lots of other things. But the writing, well, both the Trees book but this one especially, has grabbed hold of me in a way that I've never experienced before. The Trees book was a collection of short stories, and each story was its own experience. This novel was inspired by an experience I had over 20 some years ago in Germany. But I lost the moment. I just had to go back to my life and didn't really have time. And in fact, you were the one who nudged me when I told you about the idea, because I'd never written a real novel before. I wrote an ethnographic novel. But so I just kept saying, well, I don't really know how, and the time has passed, and it was too long ago. And you said, just write it.
Just do it. Just do it.
I started writing, and it drew me into this whole world of writing that, for me, was very organic and very just deeply meaningful.
So it changed you.
Sorry, what?
Did it change you?
Yes, it did. It did, because there's a lot of personal history behind it, but there's also a lot of imagining, and it really called on so many aspects of my life and experience, and my own writing, and characters that I fell in love with that have become so real to me. They're with me all the time now. So I have new friends.
So the birthing house is multi-layered and complex. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yes. And you have in here musings about language, dreams, history, words, trees. You talk about trees in here occasionally too. They come up. I think you like trees.
So
How would you characterize the genre for this book? Because again, this is really complex. There are many layers in this book. How would you characterize the genre?
yeah, I've asked myself that a lot. In fact, when you try to enter contests, you have to choose a genre. So I assumed it was literary fiction, um, as I was writing, because literary fiction does really privilege character development and depth over a sort of horizontally driven plot. Of course, it has a plot or plots, but the language you use, the depth of the characters and their experience are really important. So I would say it's literary fiction, but that's not enough.
No.
It's I also, you could say it's women's fiction, um, but the danger of that is then people immediately think romance novel. So I think it's women's fiction. I've read lots about the definitions. It's women's fiction in the way that, again, privileges character development, and language over driven plot. Um, I'm also thinking more and more that it's historical fiction. It has two timelines, and now you understand that historical can mean last week.
Right.
That's certainly last century. Um, so yeah, historical fiction. But the two awards that it's won, well, it won one and was a finalist on another. Were both in multicultural fiction. So a little of all of that, I guess.
So many genres. And you've been a college professor before. When I read this, I thought this, you could teach this as a college level course.
Yes,
Have you considered that?
it's the kind of book that I would love to have taught. Now, I was a professor of Spanish, so all of the literature I taught was in Spanish by Latin American writers, mostly.
Okay. All right. So
Uh,
so here
so,
so, so here's a question. You just mentioned a lot of different genres, right? And I
yes,
understand how it fits into all of those, which
yes,
again, makes it a challenge. Why? Because it reads as memoir. It reads very personal to me. It really feels like memoir. Why did you choose not to write this as pure memoir?
it's interesting because some people who know me who've read it say, "Oh, I see you in it all over the place," uh, and my response is, "Well, yes, but more of that is fiction than you realize." If I had chosen to write a memoir, more than half of the novel wouldn't be there. The second timeline is all imagined. A number of the characters are imagined. Um, the characters based on real people are still fictionalized. Um, and I didn't write the book that the main character is writing in the novel. In fact, I want to read. I wrote a little paragraph, as people often do, on the copyrights page.
Uh-huh.
Uh, where you say this is a work of fiction. It's
Right.
in general, it's kind of to sort of excuse you from anything that is somebody says, well, that didn't happen. But so I wrote, this is a work of fiction. I have tried to make the setting authentic to the very real town of Marburg, Germany, but the story required me to invent some details and disguise others. Family and friends may recognize themselves in some of the characters, but they too have been fictionalized, and many of the specific events were imagined. Fiction is not untrue, but rather, like all writing, it is a weaving of the threads of real experience and the filaments of the imagination.
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. So in the book, the main character, Claire, is writing in her journal to Hannah. So that the journaling is another layer of the story. And you bring up Stefan as Claire's husband, who I think might be a little bit like your Peter as your husband, as a historian, right? So Stefan uncovers these parish registers, death registers from, I think, the 1870s or whatever. And there's a line
From
in
the
there.
17,
Oh,
17
1780s. Did I get that wrong? Yeah.
1700 to 1750, something like that.
All right, all right. So death registers, right? So he's researching this, and in there, there's a line that talks about people's attitudes towards death, reveals a lot about their lives. I thought that was a beautiful idea. And so let me ask you, what's your attitude towards death?
That's an interesting question. You know, um, I have experienced loss, and in this novel, the character has had a miscarriage, and before the first timeline starts, and before the second timeline starts, it's the death of her father. I did experience both of those things. Um, but my father died when he was 90, not like in the book where it's a sudden early death that is tragic. When someone dies at 90, especially if they're not well, it can be seen as kind of a blessing. And I think different cultures experience death really, really differently. It's very much deeply rooted in culture and, for some people, religion um, and many other aspects, philosophy. Um, I think it's something we work with our whole lives to figure out. Hannah Arendt, who's a German philosopher, and also Heidegger, who she was influenced by, both said something like, death is what gives us a sense of time. That
Mm.
if if our lives were infinite, then time would be somewhat meaningless. And so, in a sense, humans have invented time by because of that finality. Um, so, um, people who believe in an afterlife don't. It's only one more step. But I do think that these moments of loss help define us. And in my own experience of losing my father, he was 90, but he was still very important to me. And the the reality of his not being around anymore is sort of impossible with someone who's been important in your life. And I found that, and this is what Clare experiences as she writes in her journal, that the loss at first is so deep that there's this huge emptiness, that just this place in your inner being that is huge but empty. And only as you begin to sort of process the grief and acknowledge it does then that emptiness refill with a presence. There's even a poem I wrote that is actually included in the book that kind of like a pregnancy, but that only protrudes inward. So I found that my father was more and more present as time went on. And all the fathers, my childhood father and my old man father and the father who was at my wedding. And so that emptiness refills with the whole presence of that person's life, that presence of that person in your life. So, but I don't think that the culture that many of us live in America and in most of the Western world, at least, I don't think it helps prepare us very well for that. But it depends on people's individual experience. But
yeah, I know a lot of people don't even like talking about it or don't even like thinking about it. And
cultures don't talk about it. Some cultures talk about it a lot.
Right.
But
I'll never.
That's one wonderful thing about fiction, because not only can you recreate things, but you can add to it. You can can imagine something into being.
Yes, I'll never forget my dad when he knew that he was near the end, and both my parents lived, to almost 89 and almost 90. My dad was almost 90, and I remember we were talking to him about what kind of service he would want. And again, he was a military veteran, and we were asking questions about that. Do you want this? Do you want that? And what do you think would be best? And he said, surprise me.
That's wonderful.
I mean, it was the best answer. Surprised me. He didn't care. He knew he believed he was going on to something better. But I just loved that.
Me means that he would be there in some way to be surprised.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Anyway, it was lovely. But so again, in this book, so many layers. You bring in difficult lives of some other women characters. Why did you choose to bring in those characters and their stories?
Yes. Some of my favorite characters are the ones I imagined. The woman from Somalia, Samira. I didn't know anyone like that, but there have been many Somali refugees, immigrants into Germany, more as time went on, particularly in the 90s. And so I wanted this to be a multicultural book. Part of Claire's experience, the protagonist, is coming out of her own grief and loss into a world that opens up into the stories of others, and seeing the loss that others have had to deal with, leaving their homeland, leaving their families, maybe having lost their families. And so this opens up her world, not only in terms of her own awareness and empathy, but it also creates a community of women who share both these losses. Some of them share a pregnancy together. I mean, there are a number of these women she meets, because they're pregnant, and they create a community of, in a sense, a new family. There's a woman from Turkey who is, so the woman from Somalia is Muslim and the woman from Turkey is Muslim, but they're both pushing back against some of the strictures, the oppression of a patriarchal society that's very rigid. And so, in a way, Clare is also doing that as a female in academia, a professor, and how women often do have to juggle motherhood and traditional expectations for women, as well as a profession and a career. And so she finds camaraderie with these women, but it also makes her pretty humble about the own suffering she feels she has endured because it's not as powerful as theirs.
Right. And so let me read a little passage in here that has, I think, something to do with that. So it's November 15th, and you're talking about Isra here, one of the gals.
This is the second time.
And right. And so Claire is writing in her journal, I think we are all migrants in search of a meaningful life as we flee the prisons that confine us. It's about freedom and belonging. We look for the webs of connection that bind us to ourselves. We are not just one thing or the simple negation of something else. What a beautiful line. And so I think we're all migrants in search of meaning. With all the traveling you've done, and you've done a tremendous amount of traveling in your life, I know. Do you still feel like a migrant?
I think there's one point in the book when Claire is talking about this and realizes that her experience as a visitor is very different than the experience of immigrants and refugees. So being a temporary migrant, particularly when chosen when you visit a country or when you live there for a while, is a very privileged state where you get to experience that immersion in another culture, that recreating yourself, which can be very profound. But it is not the same as people who've left their homeland forever or lost their whole life, their family. So Claire, again, there's one point I think where she says, after she's getting to know Samira more deeply, and she says, I really admire her. I almost envy her because she has such a sense of purpose in life and such a sense of who she is. And so her husband, Stefan, says somewhat sarcastically, oh, are you suffering because you haven't been oppressed enough and you haven't, and she's like, oh, ouch. But so I have had very profound experiences living in other cultures and immersed in other languages. That it's very humbling. It's also very inspiring. It's very difficult, but it opens up kind of new chapters in your life or new rooms in your house or lots of metaphors. But it is very, it's very profound. It deepens your sense of who you are, and you realize that who you are isn't only what formed you, what's comfortable, where you came from, but also the new experiences you have that become part of your family, part of your history. And when it's other languages, it then, I think it takes root even deeper in your soul because you learned to think and express yourself in another world.
Are you a different person when you speak different languages?
Yes, I think that's quite clear. People have told me that. You may notice that when I'm speaking in English, I do speak in a low voice. I don't know why. As I'm getting older, it's becoming a more hoarse voice. When I sing up high. And cuando hablo español, también es más alto. My Spanish voice is higher, and it's partly because of sort of purer vowels and a kind of fluidity, I think. There's more in the front of your mouth. In English, and particularly American English, we tend to talk a lot in the back of our throats, and our vowels are all sort of lost in the mouth. So I am, yes, and I, as Mother Claire says, the protagonist says that in Spanish she feels sunshine and passion and sort of a freedom. And in German, as she's relearning German, living there for a second time, she feels very sort of motherly and tender. And there's a lot of German tends to describe things and build words like Legos, putting them together. And so she becomes kind of philosophical and yeah, but it's also a tender language. It's very sweet. So
language, as you're talking about it, it has different rhythms. It's like music. I mean, music emotes.
yes,
When I hear music, I can't sit still. I'm either dancing or singing along or wanting to march with it. It makes me feel strongly, and so I can see how
yes,
talking in a different register would bring out different emotions, which is kind of fascinating. Now, one of the challenges in the birthing house is that you do include a lot of German words and phrases and Spanish, and you always translate them right after. But at first, and some readers might feel this too. At first, you might feel like skipping over that because German words can be pretty beefy, right? Pretty long. And
yes.
so I was skipping over, but then after I started reading a bit, I started recognizing some of the words, and I felt like I started learning some German, which was really kind of cool. So anyway, kudos to you on
I,
that.
of course, I'm a teacher, a language teacher. You never stop being a teacher. I would, I love for people to see new things and learn new things, new words. I didn't expect that necessarily, but um, I felt like the reader needs to be reminded that these things are happening in German and that this is another language and another world. And so even though it's a little difficult to stumble over those words, some people get annoyed. That's very much like the experience of trying to live and learn a new language and live in a place where you're guessing and you're trying to, you lose some things. And so um, I don't apologize for making it a little difficult for the reader because that's part of the experience I want them to have. But they don't have to understand any of the German words, if they don't want to. That it's understandable. It's just, oh, that's German. That's what they need to take from it.
So
But
as
it's
a bonus, I felt like I got a bonus because I'm learning some German words. I have a German friend. One of my sons is learning German, and he loves the language. All right, I want to read another thing from here, and it's a note for the book. All right.
okay.
Why do we write? Is it to document, explore, educate, to vent, understand, analyze, entertain? How does our writing begin? What will we call it? Can we really know when we start what it will be when it is finished? All fascinating questions that Clare asks herself in this book. And so let me ask you, why, with all the challenges of this book, why did you include the challenge of writing a book within a book? I mean, come on.
Just to tweak, give readers a little jab in the ribs to say, no, really. I realized, I certainly realized by the end of writing this book, but even a little before that, part of what it's about, if not the most central thing, is it's about writing. Movies about a writer trying to write are very popular. There are novels in writing about writing. And so it's not just sort of an abstract theoretical thing. It's, what does writing mean for a writer? And in this case, Clare is going through grief. She's a frustrated writer, as happens to many academics when they get a sabbatical after being completely exhausted and stressed. It's this wonderful time when you think you're going to write this wonderful book, and you're supposed to write a book or have a project. And for many, they just crash for a long time. And so the writer's block is worse than you think when you're busy with your career and your job and you can't write because you don't have time. But then when you have the time, there's this kind of blank. And so one of the things that happens to Clare during this experience, she first writes in her journal, which and each form of writing has its own sort of identity and expectations. So a journal is completely free. It's what's inside. Nobody's going to read it. It's very personal, and that helps her cope with her grief. And she starts dreaming a lot. So then she writes about that in her journal, and she writes emails to people and letters, and then starts having conversations with her husband and with all of these other people she's met. And all those things sort of feed into who she is as a person and as a writer. And so by the time she comes to the academic project she's supposed to be doing, all of these things are feeding into it. I would like to read something if I can find it. It's another notes for book. So periodically,
Okay.
she about the second half of the book, when she begins to actually write towards her big project, she has these just notes. They're called notes for book, and this is one of them. And she titles it "Writing to Understand." Writing arises out of the multiple experiences of life. Everything we see and feel and hear filters into our thinking and the way we read, the trails we follow in our research. The intellectual life is not abstract, literally drawn away from life, but rather centered in it. It is an attempt to understand deeply what we think we know experientially, a kind of self-conscious excavation to which we bring our whole selves. And so one of the main parts of the plot is Claire's healing from two different time periods of loss and finding herself through writing. In the first timeline, she's also pregnant, and so she is involved in creating this new life, this new story. In the second timeline, she's writing a book, which for her is a kind of pregnancy, a kind of organic experience that leads to a metaphorical birth.
There's a gestation of the book, right?
Yes.
Were there any surprises while you were writing The Birthing House? Were you surprised by anything in your writing?
All the time. I would sit down every morning and just because there are these sort of segments, time segments, I would sit down and say, okay, where are we? Here we are. And I might have an idea that this or this kind of thing should happen. And every time I would think, well, put on your seatbelt. I don't know where we're going to go with it. And that sort of courage every time to open yourself up to a kind of pregnancy, to an organic growth of something. Now, of course, I had all kinds of notes and ideas, and I need to do this and I need to do that. But how it was going to happen and where it was going to go in that moment was always a surprise. And the writing would generate itself forward. And of course, later you have to go back and edit and, okay, that was fun, but that's too much, But that process of letting it happen, I think in the last interview, you asked me something about writing advice. And I think I said something like, get out of your own way. That's one of the biggest things as a writer, you can't just grab something and force it into a box. That's one of the messages, by the way, in this book. One of the themes is that life doesn't fit in neat boxes, nor do people.
No, it sure doesn't. And
also, some people would say, as you asked me, why isn't this a memoir? Because a lot of it has personal experience. It's kind of autobiographical, but it's also because it's a novel doesn't mean it it's a genre fiction novel. I mean, there are various genres that many people write novels in, and you know what to expect. Mm-hmm. You know, even from the cover often, you know, okay, this one is science fiction, so I have to suspend disbelief in this way, and then go with it. This one is a romance novel, so we know more or less what's going to happen, but not all the specifics of it. So there's nothing that says that a novel can't be about a writer and even an intellectual woman. And so I needed to show, not just tell about her writing, but show it and show how, for her and for many women, everything, all you know, your inner personal emotional experience, your physical experiences, you know, having a baby, but also ideas and wrestling with thoughts and how things work. They're all connected. And so when she begins to write the book, she's inspired, you can see on the cover, she's inspired by the architectural structure of this half-timbered house. And so she begins to also think of how we write structurally. What are the foundations? What's the form? This particular form where you see this structure on the outside, you see the way the house is built, is she comes to think it's kind of like the postmodern novel, which actually is self-reflective. It includes in the story of the story.
Right, right, right. So you have given birth to many new ideas in here, many beautiful characters in here. Love Johann, love the son, Willie, who I think is maybe a little bit after your own son. Yes. But so again, multi-genre, very complex. Completely different question. What is your favorite genre to read?
Oh, you know, I like so many different kinds. It's like music, you know, and people, I'm a musician as well, and people ask, so what do you do? And I say, everything, anything that inspires me, that comes through me. And so I feel that way about writing. There's some things I read, you know, I love to read a good romance novel, or
they're fun,
you know, or I like to be entertained. In fact, sometimes since I'm writing all the time and thinking, I need something that just sweeps me away and I don't have to think a lot. But other times I like reading something that challenges me. Right now I'm reading, and my husband and I like to read aloud. Particularly I read to him, and we're reading a new book called Eve, which I highly recommend. It's about the woman's body as part of sort of the evolution of human beings. Anyway, it's a very dense, complex book, but fascinating. And it's the kind of book that you read 5 pages at a time, maybe, you know, and then think about it and talk about it. And so I think in my book, there's almost sort of competing tensions. There are plot lines, there's stories that, and particularly the characters' lives, that you get caught up in, I hope, and want to hear the rest of the story. But then it gets interrupted by these other layers. And interestingly enough, I've heard from people who've read the book, some say, you know, oh, you know, you were talking about babies and women's experience and friendship. And then suddenly you have these notes for book that Claire's writing. And then other people say, I got so lost in the notes for book and the ideas that then I wanted to find out where they go. And so I think I'm hoping that this book does both, draws you in deeply, but also carries you along. And that's a fine balance to
there's something for everyone, really. And again, this, when we talk about what's your favorite genre, reading outside your comfort zone, right? I mean, I think it's important, especially for writers, yes, to read a tremendous amount and not just in one area because that's stifling. So the birthing house was definitely outside my comfort zone. But again, I learned some things. I skipped over some things, but then I kind of went back every once in a while. And like I said,
Yeah, that's
learning some new words. It was wonderful. So I understand that the audiobook is coming out this year
yes.
sometime, and we look forward to that. And what is next for you as an author, a writer? The Trees and Other Witnesses, The Birthing House. I know you have other books out there. You dream of your father. Still, I think. Are you
Yeah,
doing anything with that? Are you doing anything with dreams? Or
you
what's
know,
next?
yeah. I mean, um,
Who knows?
surprise me. That's what I say to myself. I yeah. I don't have this long list of this is what I want to do and this is what I'm going to do. It kind of comes through me as I write. I could imagine something more about dreams. I could imagine. I don't know. Somebody said, "Well, what about a series? What happens to Clare after this?" And um, that doesn't seem like what I would do, just because you already get a glimpse of that, and she's already sort of. It seems like a fullness there, but I write poetry, and sometimes things just happen, and um, someday I think I'd like to do a new collection of poetry. Um, I'm a songwriter, so those happen also just along the way, surprises. Yeah, I'm open.
You like surprises. Do you dream in different languages?
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, yes. Yeah, I just realized when I woke up this morning, I dreamt a lot in Spanish last night. Um, but yeah, and it's usually pretty realistic. In Spanish, I'm pretty fluent. In German, I still struggle along a bit. And I
Oh,
am
that's
about to
fascinating.
go. I'm about to go to give to Curacao, which is in the Southern Caribbean, where they speak one of my favorite languages called Papiamento. It's a Creole language. Um, and I'm going because a friend of mine is presenting her book, and she and the university invited me to come and present my book there. So
That
I will
is,
start the talk in Papiamento, but then switch to English. Most people there understand English. Um, but Papiamento is something I thought of earlier, that when we're talking about languages, that's a language I started learning when I was 50. Um, and it's a Creole, so it has influence of Spanish, Portuguese, African languages, a little bit of Dutch, a little bit of English. But that's a language that I learned that you kind of have to dance when you speak it. And
ooh,
I taught it for a while to my students. And because of the African influence, you take if you want to say, uh, I sing, mi te canta. In Spanish, you'd say yo canto. But in Papiamento, it's mi te canta. So you kind of have to dance, mi te canta. So
I
I
love
can't do
that.
that language without dancing.
I
Um,
think I would love to learn that language. That sounds fascinating.
it's a fun one.
And wow, and congratulations on being asked to speak there. I think I would like for you to write your next book on dreaming in different languages and how that's different from dreaming in English. Anyway,
Well,
Kathy, oh, go ahead.
can I say one more thing before we finish? Because when you asked
Yeah,
me about surprises,
yeah.
um, in the book, you mentioned Johan, who's
Hmm.
probably one of my favorite characters, completely made up. But I had to find an older person who um, was born in the birthing house so that Claire would find out that it was a
Right,
birthing house, right?
right.
And
Yep,
um, the actual woman who owns this house, who I met, it's not the house on the cover, but
right.
said that she found out about it because an old man was walking by and said, I was born in that house.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I thought, well, I need to have some old person that Claire meets.
Some
I
old
thought it was
person.
an old woman. So Claire's walking along in a park, actually a park that we made up because it didn't exist in the town. But anyway, so she's walking along in this fictional park, and I'm expecting her to meet an old woman.
Yeah.
This old man walks by with his dog.
Surprise.
surprise.
right?
I didn't plan
Surprise.
it. I didn't think I even imagined it. He was just there, and he became just a very dear character for me. So
He is a wonderful character. He's beautiful, and everything that you write about him in there is just it touches me. Kathy Taylor, author of The Birthing House and other books, which I know you will all look up after this. Thank you, you listeners, watchers, viewers. You can find Kathy's work at catalinawrites.com. That's CATALINA writes.com. I will have links and photos. You'll send me some photos on my website at leadvillelaurel.com. Even though I live in Salida, I still go by leadvillelaurel.com. Kathy, I have learned a lot. Listeners out there, don't be intimidated by what you heard today. This is a challenging, multi-layered, multicultural, multi-genre, amazing creation, amazing birth, the birthing house. I would love to find out how your talk goes and let us know when the audiobook comes out.
yes,
Is
I'm
there
hoping in a couple months.
is there anything else you would like to leave our listeners with?
Um, Maybe just say that I don't think most readers are aware that when they read a book and they are in a sense rewriting it. It's one of the things that comes up in this book, how readers, a book is just marks on a page.
Yeah.
Uh, and every reading of it brings it back to life. And every reader brings different things to it, different tastes, different experiences, different sort of assumptions, different expectations. Um, but readers are essential to writing, to books. They're the other side. They're the other side of the other cover or the, and so I thank you if you read my book because that helps it live.
Yes.
I also understand that it'll be a different book for every person, and so you don't have to eat everything on your plate. You take what works for you, and it means for you what it means for you. So, thank you in
My
advance.
my parents used to say, "Eat every bean and pea on your plate," and I'm like, I don't want to pee on my plate. And on that note, listeners, thank you again. Check out Kathy Taylor's books, and we'll chat with you later.
And thank you, Laurel, for all that you
You're
do. You're
welcome.
a wonderful interviewer.
Thanks very much. Bye, Kathy.